What I'm presenting now draws on two larger projects, one that I've recently completed on the rise of a modernist Theravada Buddhist movement in contemporary Nepal, and one that I'm just getting going on the transnational vipassana organization established by ASI and Goenka, who you heard about earlier, and its relation to global modernity. The rise of vipassana all over the world and its instrumental redeployment outside of Asia and beyond the customary bounds of religion raises obvious and important questions about how Buddhist meditative techniques and Buddhism in general are being transformed as they're extracted from traditionally Buddhist contexts and reterritorialized in very different cultural and institutional environments. Yet the problem that I want to start from today is the fact that the same kind of changes that we associate with vipassana in North America we are also seeing in Asia. For instance, I've been doing intensive ethnographic fieldwork with Theravada reformers and traditional Newar Buddhists in the Kathmandu Valley going back to 1990. And what I've seen in this time is the popular emergence of vipassana meditation as a lay Buddhist practice, which is changing customary understandings of and ways of practicing Buddhism in the land of the historical Buddha's birth. So what I'm going to suggest today is that the exceptional appeal of vipassana as taught by Goenka to Nepalese has to do with the way that it recognizes and confirms, but also reinterprets and redefines life under the particular and changing conditions of late liberal capitalism. That is, that the rise of vipassana among Nepalese Buddhists can be seen as both a reflection of and a kind of reflection on or engagement with the moral and ethical realities of the postmodern condition as it manifests in Nepal. Compared to just 25 or 30 years ago, people there are living in a much faster-paced world of rapid change that demands new social and productive skills to survive, including the skill of constant adaptation. This has created a situation where urban Newar Buddhists are experiencing what Arthur Kleinman and his colleagues call a divided self in discussing the ways that similar political and economic processes are affecting moral and emotional lives in China. We might also think of it as an ethical crisis, using ethics in the classical sense as a kind of self-making project that answers the questions, how and for what reason should I live my life? The bottom line for many Nepalese is that traditional, including traditional Buddhist ways of answering these questions, feel out of sync with everyday reality, which is where I think vipassana comes in. Meditation, as taught by Goenka, is a modernized, rationalized practice that conforms to scientific secular norms, but it also reconfigures practitioners' experiences of self in ways that provide a unifying telos and an answer to the question of how to live, and one that has dramatically changing mainstream Theravada Buddhism in Nepal. So the bulk of the paper will talk about Nepal, but I think what's happening there has implications for the ways that we think about the rise of lay vipassana globally. Dhamma Shringa, Goenka's flagship meditation center in Nepal, is actually just one of more than 117 permanent Goenka-led retreat centers all over the world, from Canada to Costa Rica, India to Italy. And all Goenka centers teach in the same manner and according to an identical script. From the length of the retreats offered, 10-day, 20-day, 30-day, or 45-day respectively, to the registration process, to the times that the students rise and sleep, to the precise hour periods that they spend meditating. So from 4:30 to 6:30 a.m., then from 8:30 to 9:30, from 9:30 to 11, and so on for about 11 hours a day. Goenka centers follow a uniform routine. All instructions and discourses are pre-recorded by Goenka or else are authorized translations, and students listen to them on videotape or on DVD, so there's near complete standardization of both method and message, no matter where in the world you may be. Goenka's Vipassana movement is thoroughly global then, and his students are not just Nepali, but represent many different nationalities. So my discussion now is going to focus on Nepal, since this is the place I know best, although as part of my new research, I've also visited centers in the US and Malaysia, and I hope to visit others. But given the uniformity of these teachings and the fact that they demonstrably appeal to Americans and Europeans and others, as much as to folks in Nepal, I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that what's happening there might also help us to understand Vipassana's growing popularity here. I first became aware that the popular practice of vipassana was changing Theravada in Nepal in the early 2000s when, after returning for a visit after a couple years away, I began to hear people closely associated with Theravada monasteries and temples, viharas, saying things that I hadn't heard before. So at events like this one, which is taking place at a Theravada monastery and is actually, rather ironically, an event that's been organized to celebrate 3 nuns' scholarly achievements, the speakers said things like that it wasn't enough to study or learn what Buddha had taught, even though it was precisely the monks and nuns, Theravada monks and nuns' ability to explain Buddhist doctrines that attracted many of the people that you see there to Theravada in the first place. Instead, these people were saying in various ways that Buddhism was something that should be practiced or applied in daily life, so as opposed to studied. I was actually quite familiar with this rhetoric from previous trips, where I'd heard it from vipassana meditators who had been active at Theravada viharas before they started meditating. But afterwards, such folks tended to give much less energy to the monasteries on the basis that vipassana was the only and essential Buddhist practice, and thus that what was happening at viharas was basically a waste of time. Now, though, so in the early 2000s, in 2001, it seemed that the number of meditators had reached a critical level such that this meditation-centered understanding of Buddhism had become integrated into the Theravada mainstream and was actually redefining Buddhism, its purpose, and its temporality. The head of a Buddhist youth group, let's see if I can find where I am on the page. Yes, the head of a Buddhist youth group, actually, who was involved in organizing this event from that last picture and this one, said to me just a few days beforehand, in answer to another question I'd asked him, quote, "The winds have changed, different people need different things. Theravada is the best Dharma for today, the one that's most fitting, most right for our lives. When we practice Buddhism, we can change our own lives." And on accepting her award, one of the nuns who was being recognized for her scholarship, proclaimed, "It's not enough for us to only listen to Buddhism. We have to learn it profoundly and to practice it. It's the demand of the age that we apply Buddha Dharma in the world." So to cut to the chase, what I saw in 2001 was a new Vipassana-centric understanding in the Nepali Theravada community that proposed that the highest form of Buddhism was vipassana meditation as opposed to devotional or scholarly activity, that this practice should transform your everyday life in a way that brings practical benefit and particularly inner peace. And for this reasons, that it was the best Dharma for today. So let me give you just a little bit of background about the Vipassana movement inside and outside of Nepal. In the 90s, when I first started doing field work there, Vipassana was not widely practiced in the Kathmandu Valley. There were a group of nuns who'd been ordained in Burma, and they had been exposed to it there. And they sometimes taught Anapana, so breathing awareness, to their followers, and periodically brought teachers from Burma to offer short meditation camps starting in the mid-'80s. But the majority of monks who had actually been trained in Sri Lanka had little or no exposure to Vipassana, and they didn't promote it at all. So the focus of Theravada practice at the viharas was mainly on explaining Theravada Buddhist teachings to a lay audience that had grown up without access to Theravada doctrines, performing ritual and devotional services, and acting as a field of merit for the laity. And the reason that Neo Buddhists, before they came to Theravada, hadn't been familiar with the Buddha's teachings in any depth, at least as construed by the Theravada school, was that the type of Buddhism practiced in the valley, which was a Mahayana Vajrayana base, was very ritualized, and a lot of the teachings were actually esoteric and thus secret, so they weren't available to everyone. Perhaps for some of the reasons that Professor Sharp has told us already, Vipassana was not historically practiced outside of monasteries until a Burmese monk began to take on lay students after the Second World War in hopes of helping them accumulate enough merit to be reborn at the time of the coming Buddha. Other teachers followed this lead, and within a few decades, as you've heard, Leve vipassana had become a popular Buddhist practice among the Burmese laity, several of whom became teachers themselves. By the mid-'80s, periodic opportunities for lay people to learn and practice vipassana meditation had begun to appear in Nepal. But it didn't challenge or change the Theravada mainstream there until the Indian meditation teacher Goenka, who'd grown up with Burma and studied with U Ba Khin in the 50s, as you heard, returned to India. An ethnic Hindu and successful business leader, Goenkaji, as his students call him, proved a highly skilled and charismatic popularizer of vipassana outside of Burma. Over time, he adopted his teacher's method into a standardized apparatus for mass instruction that now promotes vipassana all over the world. Okay, and so here's two pictures from the Dhamma.org website that promotes his teachings. I couldn't fit it all on the same page, but you start to get a sense of it. And here's a partial list, again having to do with my not so great PowerPoint skills, of where there are Goenka centers. So Goenka gained his first Nepali students, let's see, now we can go back, his first Nepali students in the 1970s, but it was only in the 90s that the practice really took off. As early as 73, several Nepalis had the opportunity to take courses with him in India. Enthusiastic, they persuaded him to offer one of his signature 10-day vipassana camps in Nepal in 1981. This was attended by 250 people, and it was a stunning success, after which Goenka returned annually to Nepal to offer courses in borrowed spaces like schools and monasteries, but to the laity. In 87, serious efforts to establish the first Vipassana center in Nepal began when a follower donated 4 acres of land on the edge of the Kathmandu Valley. Initially nothing more than a piece of land with a farmhouse, a core group of meditators used it as a private retreat while they raised money to construct a small Dhamma hall and 2 residences, one for male and one for female students, followed by a dining hall and then a small administrative building. Within a few years, Dharma Shringa, as the center is called, began offering 1 10-day meditation course each month, and by 1994 it was up to 2 a month to meet rising demand. A typical course at that time, so in 1994, consisted of about 50 people, about half men, half women. Enrollments tended to be higher in the spring and in the summer, reaching as many as 92 students in early May and as few as 14 in late December. Now, it was somewhere around this time in the middle of the 90s that everything really started to balloon. By 2010, then, the tract had been developed to its full capacity, including an 84-cell meditation pagoda and male and female residences that allow it to accommodate up to 310 students at any given time, and even to run 2 and 3 different types of courses. So you can have a 10-day course and a Satipatthana Sutta course, or a 20-day course and a executive course separately and simultaneously. 10-day introductory courses continue to be held twice a month, and they're usually full or nearly full, often with a long waiting list. In fact, more than 6,000 people took 10-day courses at the center in 2009 alone, and many more attended for special courses of these other types or offered their labor as volunteers. To accommodate this popular demand, 4 more centers have been constructed in different parts of Nepal in recent years. And I'll just show you. So here's one of the new residence halls for the men, and you can see how big and new and by Nepali standards really nice it is. And here's the pagoda. This is, however, the building that was on land when they first bought it. So you can see the change. And this was a new female dormitory in 1994. I like this picture because it shows, one of the old early 90s buildings up against one of the new female residences, and you can get a sense of the contrast there. Such remarkable expansion offers graphic testimony of the rising popularity that Vipassana has experienced in the past 20 years, especially since the centers don't charge anything for courses, but draw their entire operating and building budgets from voluntary donations. And in this way, a trend becomes clear. Quite literally, as we'll see, the fortunes of Dhamma Shringa and the movement it began have risen with the incomes of its predominantly urban middle-class devotees. Okay. To fully make sense of the apparent attraction between middle-class Newar Buddhists and Vipassana meditation at Dharma Shringa, we need to know a little bit about the way that Goenka presents this. He's not the only one teaching Vipassana in Nepal today, but his method is by far the most successful numerically and also in the kind of commitments that it generates among its devotees. Part of this is surely the rationalized structure of the instruction, which allows strict control over students' experience, and in peripheral places like Nepal, makes for a sense of being part of a modular modernity. But where Goenka differs most from other teachers in Nepal is in his relationship to Buddhist institutional and cultural authority. He's not a monk, but, and we've heard how important this is already, a layman. And in fact, he's an ex-businessman, as he likes to say. And his centers don't represent Vipassana as a Buddhist practice, but as a universal scientific knowledge-revealing technique. So what does this all look like in practice? I would love to sort of walk you through what it's like to actually sign up and go there and so on, but I'm concerned about time, so I'll just jump to the meat of what's taught there. The actual practice of Vipassana as taught at Dharma Shringa involves training the mind to observe the corporal body and observing the physical sensations that appear. For the first 3 days, students practice breath awareness to create concentration. Then on the 4th day, they're formally introduced to the practice of Vipassana. For the remaining 6 days, then, they'll move their minds systematically over their bodies, noting how sensations appear and pass away. The key, Goenka says, is not to react. And now we're getting into some of the questions that have already been brought up. Indeed, he says the ultimate goal is to learn to see feelings and thoughts as impermanent, to realize the fact of their constant change. The body, he teaches, is nothing more than an impersonal association of what he calls in English energy impulses or subatomic particles that respond mechanically, although he's translating a Pali term there actually, but in English he doesn't use that term. He uses subatomic particles, including and sometimes when he's speaking in Hindi, which creates these subatomic particles, these impulses, he says, respond mechanically to physical stimuli and mental stimuli, actually, and produce particular effects, mind effects, creating the misimpression of enduring substance and the related illusion of unified being. This insight that this is an illusion, that is the aggregate of all of these different steps that come from misunderstanding the nature of perceptions, sensations, is said to free the meditator from a habitual identification with an illusory ego, which is the center and product of an infinite stream of repulsions and desires, liberating her, as it were, from her own self. In Goenka's words, observing reality as it is, in order to disaggregate apparent truth and to reach ultimate truth, this is vipassana. So we're moving into this world of not self, but not saying it. Thus, in a highly pragmatic way, and without specifically mentioning any explicitly Buddhist theories, Goenka nonetheless teaches his students the core Buddhist doctrine of not self, and suggests that this is the way to experience inner peace. Everyone knows, he says, I'm quoting now, everyone knows that the entire universe is constantly changing, but mere intellectual understanding of this reality will not help. One must experience it within oneself. The only way to break the illusion of self and to come out of suffering is to learn to explore within oneself and to experience the reality of one's own physical and mental structure. What's particularly fascinating to me here is the way that this rhetoric extracts a particular meditative technique and also, as we've seen, a particular version of it from a much broader set of Buddhist teachings and practices in order to define it as a universal truth that is not a religion. Goenka is clear that vipassana is what the historical Buddha taught, yet he's adamant that it's not a religion, Buddhist or otherwise. Instead, as I said, he describes it as a method or as a technique. The code of discipline that people sign when they submit applications to the course, which they can either do at the downtown center, sort of welcome center in downtown Kathmandu, or online through a centralized international online system. This code reads, "The entire path is a universal remedy for universal problems and has nothing to do with any organized religion or sectarianism. The rules are not for the benefit of the teacher or the management, nor are they negative expressions of tradition, orthodoxy, or blind faith. Rather, they're based on the practical experience of thousands of meditators over the years and scientific and rational." So here's part of where this way of thinking comes from. This is what the code that people read before they can have any exposure to any of this agree to, are informed by and agree to. So one thing should be clear, Goenka writes, this is definitely not the Buddhist religion. At the same time, it's definitely the teachings of the Buddha. What's necessary then is to, quote unquote, and he puts it in quotes, know thyself, advice which every wise person has given. We must experience directly the reality of this mental physical phenomenon. This direct experience of our own inner reality, this is what's called vipassana meditation. So what we see here is a modernized, rationalized, laicized, and industrialized approach to meditation being promulgated and used to bring Buddhist insights to those who are firmly ensconced in secular realities. And by the end of the 20th century, when the majority of urban Buddhists had been raised and educated in this discursive ecumene, this was, I think, a significant factor contributing to his interest in teaching. Where monks and nuns can't help but present vipassana as a Buddhist practice, no matter how rationalized Theravada Buddhism may be compared to traditional Newar Vajrayana practices, Goenka's status as a layman and his erasure of religious imagery and symbolism and language, specific language, reinforces his presentation of meditation as a pragmatic activity suited to a modern worldview. And I'd note that there isn't a single Buddha image installed in the whole of Dhamma Shringa or in any of the centers that I've visited. Likewise, and you can see that in this picture, monastics sit at the same level, or lately just slightly higher than lay students when they are, meditating, when they're taking a course, but still lower than the assistant teacher's seats. And I want you to this is not the Nepali Center, because I couldn't find a picture of that. This is a new center that's opened a few years ago in Georgia, but it looks an awful lot like the center in Kathmandu. And you can really see how very stripped down this is. And then there's the stress on instrumental utility. So consider a speech given by the senior teacher and trustee Rup Jyoti at the Boston Rotary Club. He says, "I'm a businessman economist from Nepal. I've received many practical benefits from vipassana. I've found out the benefits of observing sila. I don't easily get angry or upset, so I don't waste time on these things. If I'm wavering on some decision, sila and Dhamma show me the way so I save time. I'm more aware of responsibilities. I'm more effective as a manager. When you realize that vipassana can give you so much benefit and also save time, it becomes easier to find time to sit for vipassana meditation every day." Again, note the pragmatism and also the presumed problems that underlie this testimony, and that vipassana becomes a solution to. Jyoti introduces himself as a businessman and concludes that vipassana is a smart investment, one that's helped him to succeed professionally by becoming a better and more efficient manager of himself. Goenka uses the same rhetoric, arguing that a meditator's, quote, capacity to work will increase manifold, unquote, because vipassana improves general efficiency. And this is, of course, related to increasing happiness and peace in Nepal today. So a lot of this is familiar to people who've spent time at Buddhist centers in North America. But finally, we're ready to talk about what Nepalis mean when they refer to this as appropriate for today. In Deep China, in his book Deep China, Arthur Kleinman and fellow contributors explore the psychological impact of recent changes in China in order to understand the way that social transformations affect moral and emotional lives, focusing particularly on the ways that the weakening of collective structures, both economic and social, has led to a greater emphasis on individual capabilities and obligations. The authors propose that the freedoms of the 1990s have led many Chinese to experience what they call a divided self. Millions of people who were previously taught to put group interests before individual desires are now expected to be proactive, rationally calculating about their own self-interest, competitive and consuming, as befits, quote, a highly mobile, increasingly plural and individualized society, as well as a continuing national quest for modernity. And the result, he says, is a kind of existential and moral confusion and the absence of any ethical order. Kleinman says, a new person is being created in a new world, and both are divided by the political, economic, and cultural processes that constitute 21st century China. Nepal has a somewhat different political, cultural, and economic history, of course. For instance, they got their Maoists in 1996. But the problems that Kleinman identifies are very much at work there also. Before 1990, the country was an absolute monarchy ruled by a king and a single aligned political party, entirely closed to the outside world until the 1950s, or close to the West until the 1950s. The country adopted a government-led import substitution-based economy through the 70s and 80s, protecting its markets and incipient national industries with tariffs and other barriers to international trade. In 1990, all of this changed when a popular movement forced King Birendra to transfer governmental power to a democratically elected multi-party government, which, following advice from the IMF, immediately began to liberalize the economy. The country adopted a range of business-friendly trade and monetary policies, slashing tariffs and privatizing state-run industries and services, thereby opening the door to neoliberal capitalism. And what I want you to see in this picture, which I chose in part because it's pretty, but is all of the building that's happening, the way that this, very fertile valley is becoming urbanized and becoming built. So all of this has changed life in Nepal radically, creating a generation that values science over traditional knowledge and producing ways of living and working that didn't exist before. Today, the son of a goldsmith, which is a traditional Newar occupation, is more likely to become a banker or an engineer than to continue the family tradition. And the children of parents who once worked the fields now run development projects and garment factories. I won't have time to flesh this out, but in the past, Newar Buddhists primarily operated in terms of inherited social identities. Individuality and innovation were downplayed in public life. In the economic realm, children inherited the occupations and commercial property of their parents, including skills and guild memberships. And in the socio-religious domain, fulfilling your duties as a member of your caste, lineage, gender, and so on was critical to establishing moral respectability and ultimately was what constituted a life well led. Recently, however, these inherited forms of social and economic personhood have come into conflict with the market reforms that I've been describing. So by the mid-'80s, Laura A. Hearn had noted an emerging discourse in rural Nepal that highlighted self-sufficiency, hard work, development, success, and individual responsibility, and that assumed a sense of self, she says, focused on individualism and the consumption of commodities. Such ideals are also current in Kathmandu, and they reflect broader shifts in the culture of late capitalism. 2 decades ago, David Harvey proposed that the post-60s shift from a factory-based post-Fordist economy to one based on flexible accumulation, immaterial labor, and just-in-time production had given rise to a generic cultural experience of volatility, ephemerality, and fragmentation that he called the condition of post-modernity. And Emily Martin's work has showed how a kind of fragmented, flexible personhood is becoming a taken-for-granted part of American life. She writes, as many overarching social institutions of the corporation and the state shrink, the person must become the site of a flexible collection of assets. Individuals shape-shift in their changing environments. People with the resources to do so are increasingly speaking of themselves as mini corporations, collections of assets that must be continually invested in, nurtured, managed, and developed. As in North America, so in Nepal, or at least that's what I take from the fact that meditators praise Vipassana's benefits for self-management. But we can see here the makings of a crisis that's both economic and existential for those who find themselves caught between economic and ethical orders and compelled to shapeshift. So basically, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I think that the current popularity of Vipassana in Nepal, and to some extent elsewhere, follows from the observation, my explanation of the current popularity follows from the explanation that what Goenka teaches is strangely resonant, and I do mean strangely, with the modern neoliberal ethical environment and the new kinds of personhood it demands. From a certain point of view, Goenka's explanations of the nature of reality conform, but then reinterpret people's experiences of life in the world in ways that provide a coherent and meaningful telos, if not a sense of integrated self per se. And that's kind of, this is strange. And perhaps actually it provides the opposite in as much as it tries to de-objectify or to follow borrow Professor Klein's language, to denoun the world, denoun the world that people are living in. So things in Nepal are changing. People can't control their environments and bring about desired outcomes or avoid undesired ones. Inconstancy is the rule. So while it may not be an uncontroversial argument that Vipassana is the highest of Buddhist, an uncontroversial argument that Vipassana is the highest of all Buddhist practices, as we're now hearing in Nepali temples, it's also not true that meditators are suffering a false consciousness, as Mark Lichty seems to imply when he calls Vipassana a quasi-scientific self-help technique for the modern middle class. To the contrary, in fact, things really are that fluid in Nepal today. And to think or act otherwise feeds an unhealthy attachment to a disappearing order that is indeed very likely to bring suffering and perhaps poverty as well. Marxists would say this is the deceptive power of the commodity, which confuses us into accepting our capitalist worlds. Goenka and his followers say that this is the deceptive nature of ordinary perception, which can be overcome through insight-producing scientific techniques. So let me return very briefly to the question of what this means for the ways that we think about mindfulness practices and the way that they travel. If what I'm proposing has any merit at all, and I offer it as much as a thought experiment as a entirely hashed out argument, but I'll stand behind it, then paying close attention to the Nepal case has implications for the kinds of questions that scholars ask as we think about Vipassana's supposed migration to the West. Anthropologists, like me, typically assume that cultural contexts are critical in the sub-study of religion and thus, of course, related contemplative practices, and we've tended to map religious cultures geographically as well as historically. Yet, in this case, the local agency of tradition may be less of a factor influencing Buddhist practice than global forces that are reshaping national and transnational economies. To take this argument further, I need to attend carefully to the real and important differences in the ways that late capitalism is impacting Nepal versus, say, Canada. And I don't want to be seen as an economic reductionist. The fact that we can see parallels to contemporary mindfulness movements throughout Buddhist history, as we've heard, tells us that this is only part of the story at the very best. But there are enough similarities here that I think that the travel metaphor shouldn't be the only way that we think about the globalization of mindfulness techniques. And in particular, I think that we do well to ask what forces and conditions are at play in different places at different times that maybe bring particular practices of the self to the fore, which could trouble inherited notions of socio-cultural, socio-religious boundaries, and bring us back to the questions that we ended this last, that we were talking about before break, as well as offer a new lens onto meditation and its popular spread. And I also do not have any conflicts of interest, although if anyone wants to give me money, I'd think about it.